Academic Standard Philosophy course. Hi everyone! We've returned to ancient Greece.
Let's review a little. Moving away from myth, Thales sought in reality, the origin power, arche. The idea initially assumed that, arche was some material, as hylozoism. It developed into the ontology, that, the whole world has the power. However, since Herodotus, people realized that, nomos is different depending on the time and place, and the sophists tried to manipulate public opinion, and arbitrarily change it.
Socrates questioned them, revealed that they knew things less than him, and asked people to listen to the voice of daimonion, their own conscience. Nevertheless, his disciples misunderstood the daimonion and became just selfish, so Socrates was executed. Then what happened?
It was a confusing age. In addition to Athens and Sparta, the inland Thebes rose, and a tyrant appeared in Syracuse, on the far western island of Sicily. Thus, the four Greek countries were at war, and the Pythagorean society of southern Italy was involved in these conflicts. Persia, Egypt, Phoenicia, and Rome also intervened in the disputes. Furthermore, the northern barbarian Macedonia was gaining power. Therefore, the schools of ISOCRATES and PLATO were expected.
However, who was ISOCRATES? I've not heard much of him.
ISOCRATES was one of Gorgias' disciples. However, outraged by Socrates' forced execution, he silently protested, by wearing mourning clothes. He sympathized with Socrates, who questioned the fishy sophists.
Wait, his master Gorgias was also a sophist, wasn't he?
Gorgias was an oddball among the sophists. He was a native of Sicily, and was a friend of the pessimistic Empedocles. As a competent lawyer, he was sent to Athens, to manipulate public opinion, before the Peloponnesian War. But, unable to return home, due to the outbreak of the war, he had no choice but to become a live performer of sophistic technique, for money. He was an agnostic skeptical of a truth. Therefore, his argument strategy was, to joke that opponents did not know precisely.
His argument was similar to Socrates. It was natural that his disciple Isocrates also sympathized with Socrates.
After the war and the execution of Socrates, Gorgias at 91, retired in 392 BC, and handed over his students, to his most notable disciple, Isocrates. Respecting the ideal of free citizenship in Greece, he imposed no policy on his students. Instead, he asked his students, to acquire culture widely, had them write speeches with deep consideration, and guided them individually, by correcting their drafts.
Isocrates' education was like Confucius.
However, this was just a means, to examine their thoughts. As well as his master Gorgias, he was also agnostic and skeptical, and, disliking frivolous sophists and their disciples, and following Socrates' midwifery, he called his method, philosophy, craving wisdom. It would be the first example of using the term.
Namely, he made them aware through the method, how less they understood issues than they believed.
On the other hand, Plato's position was bad. He was the nephew of Critias, a tyrant who ruled Athens, as an agent of Sparta, and, as well as Critias, he was also a disciple of Socrates. Therefore, when Socrates was executed in 399 BC, he had gone into hiding.
The Democrats would want to get rid of him too.
However, after that, the international situation changed dramatically. When a plague spread in the western island of Sicily, tyrant Dionysus expelled the Phoenicians, and founded the mighty state Syracuse. Also, after Persia wiped out the rebels in Asia Minor, it supported Thebes in the Greek interior, to make it against Sparta and Athens. Here, Athens again adopted the pincer operation, and tried cooperating with the Orphic Pythagoreans in southern Italy.
What did that have to do with Plato?
Along with his midwife mother, Socrates worshipped the ancient Earth Mother, the goddess of birth and fertility. However, it was more of a native peasant belief. Therefore, the sons of noble conquering Greek families, Socrates' disciples like Alcibiades, Critias, and Plato, were Orphists. It overturned the rebirth myth of the Earth Mother, and instead insisted that, this very world is rather the underground, and that, we should escape from here, and return to the heavenly world. Pythagoreans were a sect of it, and sought to purify their soul, through pure thought, mathematics.
Socrates' disciples arbitrarily did as they pleased because they believed the world was an inherently polluted place to abandon.
However, to cooperate with the Pythagoreans in southern Italy, the Orphists of Athens, even Socrates' disciples, were also reinstated. Taking advantage, young Plato accused the unfair execution of Socrates, and wrote Apology of Socrates. Furthermore, the sequel, Crito, depicting the trial and execution of Socrates in a dramatic style. These books became popular.
Although having been utterly made a fool of by the sophists, the Athenians easily changed their attitudes again. Was Plato also a new sophist?
No, Plato was against sophists without belief, who only thought about outwitting their opponents. He would like to know what Socrates' daimonion was. So he wrote further dialogues, Protagoras and others, in which Socrates questioned former famous sophists on arete or human goodness.
Are they true stories?
As well as Apology, he probably had not been present there. Those were merely dialogues, to examine human goodness, using the name of Socrates and the sophists. However, he came to the paradoxical conclusion that goodness is knowledge but cannot be taught, and here, he established the Orphic anamnesis theory, in Meno. According to him, we already know goodness well, in heaven before birth, and just recall it, with some cue in this world.
In the end, what is the goodness?
About 388 BC, he went abroad to study the goodness from the Orphic Pythagoreans. Unfortunately, they were in trouble with Dionysius, the tyrant of Syracuse in Sicily. So on their behalf, Plato negotiated a settlement with the tyrant Dionysius, but his preaching infuriated Dionysius, and he was sold into slavery.
He was too young to be a negotiator.
As luck would have it, an acquaintance found him, and repurchased him. Plato tried to pay him back, but the acquaintance used the money to buy a small manor in the Academy Forest, northwest of Athens, and gave it to Plato. So at 40, he opened there a small school, in 387 BC.
But did anyone want to attend Plato's school?
Well, the existing ISOCRATES school had a better established educational system, and more proven results, since Gorgias. So in his new book Gorgias, Plato criticized ISOCRATES school, and argued that Plato's academy was superior to it. There, he made Socrates denounce Gorgias, with the analogy of arts. According to it, just as the art of cosmetics, to make someone look sound, is inferior to the art of medicine, to make someone really sound, rhetoric to make something look good, is inferior to philosophy to make things really good. In addition, not those who overcome others, but those who overcome themselves, have true arete.
However, Isocrates imposed on his disciples to write speeches, to examine and become aware of their ignorance. That method would be the very art of medicine for thought, to make it really good, and it would be closer to Socrates.
But Socrates discussed with sophists ad lib, and wrote no speeches. In fact, Isocrates was a poor public speaker, and could not hold live dialogues, differently from his master Gorgias, so he had to correct his disciples' speeches, in the drafts. On the other hand, Plato emphasized dialectic, live discussions in groups, like his master Socrates.
Isocrates also had a weak point.
However, Plato's academy had another problem. Homosexuality was not so uncommon in ancient Greece, but Plato's academy was a macho group of only gays. Therefore, people suspected them of being a bizarre cult group, like Socrates and his conspirators. Hence, Plato showed symposium or banquet, in 385 BC. There, Socrates' disciples performed speeches, praising the god of love, Eros. They rather boasted about being gay, because gays are the descendants of the Sun tribe, those who were stuck two men together. People are looking for the other halves they lost in this world. That is love. Philosophy, seeking lost wisdom, is the most wonderful love.
At least, homosexuality is better than political conspiracy.
Moreover, around 380 BC, he wrote the Phaedo, as a discussion just before Socrates' execution. In it, he made Socrates an Orphic Pythagorean, and had him say that philosophy is practicing death, by purifying one's soul. He said, our bodies are prisons, and bind us to the earthly world. What we see and hear, are just shadows, while the true things or the idios, exist in heaven. However, even the shadows share a little of the idios, so, by examining the shadows, namely, words, we can approach the ideas. Thus, he grounded his method of dialectic.
He was quite different from the real Socrates, who knew his own ignorance.
When ISOCRATES' disciples began to be active, although he could not make a public speech, he was also interested in politics. ISOCRATES at 56, published a speech manuscript, panegyric, or for all nations, for the 100th Olympiad, in 380 BC. He argued that, the Greeks were the people, who had a democratic culture of free citizenship like Athens, and that, we should unite against Persia, and expand our civilization through expeditions. He said, war is a festival game for peace. And actually, Athens called upon Polis, around the Aegean Sea, to form a new alliance, in 377 BC.
He would not be against Persia, but against Sparta again.
On the other hand, Plato, from a distinguished family, was skeptical of democracy. According to his Republic, published about 370 BC, the human soul is made of a mixture of gold, silver, and bronze, i.e., reason, courage, and desire, so we are divided into three classes, by the proportions of these metals. The golden people should be rulers, the silver people should be soldiers, and the bronze people should be workers.
He believed a class system should be introduced even among free citizens.
However, in that book, Plato denied even the republic or aristocracy of the golden people, and insisted on the dictatorship of the philosopher king, embodying goodness. Plato explained the politics, with three analogies. First, the analogy of the sun, as well as everything can be seen, only by being illuminated by the sun, things can be known, only with the idea of goodness. Next, the analogy of line segments, just as the same proportion as vision to knowledge, there is an impression to the existence, in vision, and a provisional to the reality, in knowledge. Last, the analogy of the cave, we are in fact the prisoners in a cave, and imitate things pass behind us, so that we can see only the shadows on the wall, made by the fire. But only the philosopher king escapes to the outside, and knows the idea of things.
In short, is the philosopher king the son of our reason?
But he here fell into an aporia, the dead end of his theory. Even if a man goes out of the cave, the outside is too bright by the true sun, the idea of goodness. Therefore, the philosopher king could barely know the ideas, by following the shadows. In addition, even if he returned to the cave, he could not tell about the ideas, to the prisoners in the cave, because his story was also just another shadow for the prisoners. Therefore, referring to the Pythagorean theory, Plato tried to establish a new theory, on sharing to derive many from one, in Theaetetus and Parmenides, but could not finish it.
As long as ideas should be recalled individually, they could not be transmitted from person to person.
Although Plato's political theory had such a critical defect, a northern barbarian Macedonia was interested in the dictatorship, and wanted to invite Plato as an advisor. But just in 367 BC, the tyrant of Syracuse, Dionysius, suddenly died, and, asked to educate the new king, Dionysius II, Plato left for Syracuse. So Macedonia sent a talented young man, Aristotle, to study at Plato's academy.
So, was Plato successful in the education of Dionysius II?
No. Although admiring Plato, he ended up becoming a tyrant like his father. Thus, Plato's authority was lost. During his absence, an excellent young Macedonian student, Aristotle, began to lecture on rhetoric, at Plato's academy, without his permission. Isocrates was even worse. Believing in the hegemony of Athens in Greece as ever, he recklessly advocated a complete resistance against Thebes, although it was supported by the great Persia, so that, even his disciples would not listen to him.
Old men, who do not fight themselves, are always brave.
As the culmination of his thoughts, old Plato planned a trilogy of sophist, statesman, and philosopher, with the Pythagorean theory. He argued here a criticism against fraudulent arts, and came to think that, the creation of truth, belongs to God. Therefore, he considered the problem, on the God's side, and planned a new mythic trilogy, Timaeus, Critias, and Hermocrates. In Timaeus, he described the process, where the god Demiurge created the universe and humans. In Critias, he began to show the first civilized state, Atlantis, but he stopped there, and couldn't write Hermocrates on the following history.
I wonder why he always starts writing before he completes his thought.
However, With the myth of the demiurge, old Plato hit upon a resolution for a long-standing problem, how to connect many to one, and he wrote Philebus, about 355 BC. According to it, the universe is created by a mixture of matter and reason, and humans also have partially rational souls. So, the soul seeks their unification, against the physical pain of the difference between visions and knowledge. The right way is mathematical philosophy, so he thought.
From the beginning, he believed mathematics was the right way, like the Pythagoreans.
Around this time, Athens was in a predicament. Thebes and others rebelled, and even Persia was planning to invade Athens. Here, 81-year-old ISOCRATES published on the piece, and Areopagiticus, in 355 BC. These called on Athens to abandon imperial exploitation, to restore the Senate of Athens, and to make it rule all Greece. Interestingly, in his last work, Laws, old Plato also came to the same plan, the government not by the philosopher king, but by the Senate. However, it was a prison-like state, that bound people, with rules and plans of mathematical proportions. However, people laughed at these senile men, and ignored them.
In short, they would only want to say to leave politics to the old them. Although such countries were actually realized in modern times, almost all were corrupt and failed.
Plato died in 347 BC, at the age of 80. On the other hand, Isocrates lived longer. He insisted as ever, on fighting against Persia, even with the help of the northern barbarian Macedonia. But when the very Macedonia invaded Greece in 339 BC, he died at 98.